What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Friday Morning Freestyle. I am Dan, coming at you live from the Hard Knocks Talks studio. If you're watching this on Facebook, please jump over to YouTube. We are going to stop streaming to Facebook very soon. Very soon. We'll still be present on Facebook, but all our streaming and all our long-form content will be on YouTube. So help us out. Jump over there. Show some support. Today, we have Dr. James Dixon. I waited for a long time. I'm going to bring you in. Here we go. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Dan. And good morning, everyone who's listening. Barb, I see you out there trolling me already. Hello.
Yes. She is the unofficial. No, I know she's the official Hard Knocks Talks troll.
Yeah,
she does it in a classy way.
Yeah.
Like I've never wanted to block Barb for anything that she said.
No.
So
it's
always
trolling and fun. Yeah.
It's always been very endearing.
Yes,
yeah.
of course. Yeah. If you're going to be trolled by someone.
It would, and Sharon's good too. Sharon Acus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sharon,
She's a little rougher around the edges than Barb, but
sometimes people need that.
Yeah. Barb's the hand holder. Sharon's the one that cuffs you upside
Good
the head.
cop, bad cop. Maybe a bad analogy. Yeah.
Good researcher, bad researcher. So, James, speaking of researchers,
yes.
You are a researcher.
I am. Yes.
We're here to talk about language today, but also social determinants. Now, before we dive in too far to that, why don't we just what would you define a social determinant as in the short form context?
Yeah, social determinants of health are kind of the broad conditions and factors within which we live that affect every single one of us, that affect our health and our well-being. So things like gender, culture, income, employment, physical location, many different things are captured in social determinants of health. We all are affected by social determinants of health. We all live in different conditions, and that affect our day-to-day lives. And the world that we live in affects our health and our well-being. So these are the factors and the determinants that we've labeled as such that we know and impact our health and well-being, including substance use and mental health.
So I had an experience. And some good conversation came from it the other day. So this Sunday's guest, her name is Missy Hume. Her daughter is a person who uses drugs. And she did a post a little while ago talking about her experiences with a loved one who uses drugs. And it blew up. And she just had a picture of her daughter. And it got 200,000 shares. It just blew up on Facebook. You see the picture and it would be weird if you didn't recognize it. It was so saturated. And so I shared that post to bring awareness to her upcoming live stream. Hey, this person's coming on with this powerful post. Come join us. And there was some people in the community that didn't respond positively to her referring to her daughter as an addict. And I get it, and you get it. I'm sure you understand that there can be quite a heavy stigmatic connotation attached to the word addict. However, her daughter, that's how her daughter chooses to identify. And she gets behind that word, and this is who I am. This is my experience. So, what are your thoughts around that? In the research that you do, very heavily immersed in language at times.
Oh, yeah. Constantly on it.
Tell us a little bit about, maybe even a little bit about the history. When did it start to come to light that maybe we shouldn't stop doing this, or maybe we shouldn't be using these words?
That's a great question. And the question of language and how we talk about and refer to, people who use drugs and just substances in generally has really evolved. I've been in this world for just over 10 years, and just even in that time, the way we talk about and the importance of language, it's shifted a lot, even just over a short period of time. So in terms of that shift, I would say, really did start coming about with the more of harm reduction, as harm reduction became more and more popular, and more and more space created for folks with living experience. That's, I'd say, when the conversation really started, was when we started to hear the voices and prioritize lived and living experience, and started to hear and learn that the way that we talk about substance use and people who use drugs is actually, there's a lot of harm in a lot of the language and the way that folks think about and understand it. And so in bringing all of that to light in the more recent decades, and it's always been, I would say, there, but just it's kind of taken off in more recent years, and partly because of harm reduction, also because we're in this overdose crisis where drugs and conversations about drugs are much more common and much more prevalent than they've ever been, because it's such a pressing health issue. So language is now very common, and it's on the forefront of, all of these conversations. And in the research world, we're all about language.
No,
like,
and
we're nothing without words.
And I get
so,
that. Like in conversations that I've had with you, and that I've had with our friend Barb, and even Colleen Dell, all of the people, when you're talking about substance use in an academic paper, you use very different language typically than you would that coming on Hard Knocks Talks and talking in language that's more accessible, So what concerned me about the conversation that was taking place around this post that this woman made, the message was at risk of being hindered.
Yes.
Because the language was not solely first person focused, and like, do you see that? Do you see a hindrance in
I
this?
do. And I think, your example and the story that you're sharing is an excellent example of why we can't solely focus on language. I think there is a time and a place to focus on language, and especially in, the research world where words mean a lot, if not everything that we do. And in public platforms where like a platform like this where you're reaching a large audience, I think language does matter.
Pumping my ego.
Just for you, Dan. Yes. But I do think language matters, in a service provider world, in the research world, where it's folks who are working in this world and trying to do their best to do some kind of supportive job or something that's related to this, whether it's research, frontline service delivery, management, what communications, what have you. I think it's important for language to be a priority there, because we want to communicate and work with folks and do it in as least harmful way as possible.
No, go ahead. Finish.
I was just going to say, on the other side,
you're going to point at me like that.
Yeah.
You're going to finish what you're saying.
Because I see that side and where language is really important. But on the other side, and talking, when you mentioned a hindrance, just like your guest had mentioned, like her daughter uses the word addict to describe herself. And I think we sometimes get lost in the language, particularly with folks who might have that living experience, or who might use words that, professionals or researchers would avoid using in their reports and things like that. But we do it because we don't want to cause harm in the words that we use. But it's important to recognize that, we don't get to decide that. We as researchers are not the folks who are telling, we don't want to tell stories and put words in folks' mouths for them. So honoring how people identify and see themselves is something that I think is crucial. And I think the policing of language, there is a time and place for language to be a conversation. But I think, that if the focus is purely on language, or if language takes precedence over other topics of conversation or how you could engage, that it actually does, it can hinder a relationship, and it can hinder, a conversation happening in a real way when you kind of get lost in those details.
It stops being about discussing the challenges, and the challenge becomes discussing how to discuss the challenges, So,
and if you're telling someone how they should be discussing their own lived and living experience, like, you're breaking, like, that's a boundary that,
I mean, that's the behavior we're advocating against, isn't it?
Exactly. That's it. Exactly.
We can't become what we're advocating to change. We're talking about people should be able to identify how they wish, and if you want to get into, well, we probably, the gender thing is a whole another thing, but as an example though, for this woman's message to get taken down from certain communities, simply because she used the word addict, to me that it doesn't seem productive. I think that having conversations like that and seeing and engaging with conversations like that with people who are using the language is an excellent opportunity to educate and to better understand. And even if they don't choose to use the language, other people are listening.
Exactly. And I've been in conversations where people have heard the language that I use very intentionally, and they'll be like, "Oh, I hear that you're phrasing something this way or that way," and they'll ask about it, and if it's because of a stigmatizing word or two, it's like, okay, like, people do listen. And I think something that's plays into all of this is the idea of meeting people where they're at, a
Mm-hmm.
principle of harm reduction. But, people have different ways of understanding themselves and their own substance use. And that might mean that they bring in and use language that is maybe stigmatizing in some different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean we want to stigmatize them for using language. Like, we
Yeah.
want to meet them where they're at. And it's
Yeah.
exactly what you said. It's
Yeah.
an opportunity for maybe some education,
Yeah.
or if not, if there's other pressing conversations or issues to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like language is one of the ones that you can let slide in certain contexts,
Mm-hmm.
like especially in like a supportive environment, or like a like a support services type of setting. But
Mm-hmm.
language can slide, and I think it needs to slide sometimes.
When I was new in recovery, I was really heavily involved in the anonymous fellowships,
Mm.
and I was very proud. Like I would say, my name's Dan, and I'm an addict.
Mm-hmm.
And that became who I was. Like that, I was the addict in recovery. I was the single dad. I was these things, right? And as I'm growing on my journey, and I'm moving forward to a place of discovery rather than recovery. I've never been to this place before. How can I be recovering,
Mm-hmm.
something that I've never known?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like I don't really identify that way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, that was my path, and I'm still someone who probably shouldn't use substances because I have one and then I want another one.
Mm-hmm.
But like, do you run into that in your data collection or in your research and your community engagement, where you refer to someone as someone who uses drugs and they say, no, I want to be called an addict?
I've never been called out on something like that, where using improper language. Well, actually, maybe that's not entirely true, but
A lot of people don't like the term clean.
and
Mhm.
that's another one that
And I get that.
yeah,
I get it. I can get behind that.
yeah, like that's another one that I try to avoid using. But I've
Mhm.
never been told to switch my language, particularly around like substance use or people who use drugs, because I kind of default to the person first,
Mhm.
least stigmatizing ways of speaking about things. And I think, as a researcher and a person who works in this field, and like who does a lot of stuff with words, like written words and communication, I think it's my responsibility and my obligation to do the work and to have these conversations in
Mhm.
the most ethical and appropriate way as possible. And to me, that means I'm going to prioritize using language that I know isn't going to be stigmatizing.
Mhm.
And so I've never really been called out on it before, not in this.
Do
I've
you
been
think
called out for some other bad language in other contexts, but not in this conversation.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, do you think there's some advocacy organizations out there that are like going too far? Like with their push on language, with their like, no, we're not going to hear that story because they use this word.
Mm.
You know,
Are there organizations that?
I think there are.
Okay. Yeah, like if it's hindering like a potential building of a relationship with folks accessing services, then I
Hmm.
would say that is harmful. Like, if
Hmm.
service providing organizations are crucial, they're crucial in our communities. They are a link often for many people, in community, to other types of services. And so accessibility,
That
I
should
think,
be
is
like
primary. Yeah,
paramount.
exactly. And
Yes, please
so
come use the language, get
exactly,
services.
like,
Yeah.
and so that's kind of where, yeah, if people are being turned away at the door, or if they're being dropped from
Hmm.
lists, or like
Well, from
client
like
lists
even
because of language.
and recovery communities online. Okay, we can sit here and pretend that Facebook is just a little video game that you look at when you're on the crapper. And for lots of people it is, but a lot of people, I feel, don't take the power of it seriously enough.
Hmm.
Like these Facebook groups that we're all a part of, like we've got 14,000 members,
Hmm.
and typically, it's pretty peaceful in there,
Hmm.
but that's typically because unless people are spouting hate or spitting in the faces of other people's beliefs, we let it slide.
Hmm.
We've got religious people, we've got not religious people, we've got program people and not program people, and sometimes there's a little bit of disagreement. We've only, out of the 14,000 members that we have now, only twice have we had to block someone.
Hmm.
And this group's been running for 2 years.
Hmm.
So, And many productive conversations have been fostered in there from people who have opposing views and use different languages. You know, the one rule that I have that is paramount in that group is don't be an asshole. And the second rule is I get to decide who's being an asshole. And that's power. Honestly,
Yeah.
I don't want that. I wish I didn't have that power, to be honest. Well, I'm glad that somebody does, right? But I don't like having to decide this is right and this is wrong, you know, because if I've learned anything in my time doing this show, is that it's I don't want to use the term dangerous, but I'm gonna. It's dangerous to be black and white, to think like this is right, this is wrong. Because like in conversations like this, you know, you'll influence my thoughts and I'll think, yeah, that's great. And then I'll get behind it. And then tomorrow I'll learn something new. And I'm like, damn, and yesterday I said something wrong, you know?
Yeah.
So these online groups and pages and communities, I think it's important to be as inclusive as possible, even if the language isn't, you know, quite exactly on point. You know?
And yeah, and saying it's not black and white, that I completely agree with. And I think that's where harm reduction has so much success, is that it hangs out in that gray area in between, and it really questions, it forces folks to question, you know, that black and white duality of like, you should or shouldn't be doing drugs. Well, there's a middle line there. And so that's part of one of the things I love about harm reduction, is that you work in that kind of blurry area where you can't assume or take anything for granted.
You need flexibility.
You need
to be teachable. And you need to offer information in a way that's not like authoritarian.
Yes.
You know?
And like this language conversation it's evolved a lot over the last, like, just since the year 2000, like the last 20 years, it's evolved so much. There's a lot of education. Like, I'm in the research world and I'm reading about this stuff constantly, and I'm still it's still changing. Like, you don't just hit a peak and all of a sudden, oh, we've got the language figured out, we're solved. Like,
now what are we gonna do?
Yeah, like, now we can talk about something else finally. No, like, it's a constant evolution. And so, you know, I think it's unfair to expect every person to have that same level of knowledge and education about why language matters, and you know, what type of language maybe we should be using. That's another word I don't really like, but like, what language is more appropriate or less stigmatizing. It's, you can't assume that people know that, and that, you know, when you referred to gender and things like that, like, I think there's a huge education piece that that also serves to hinder like a productive conversation or building a relationship with someone, when you're getting hung up on what the exact words should be. Like, it alienates before it brings people together, and we need to, I think it's more important we bring people together and then like work together to figure out how we can keep you know, a productive and unstigmatizing conversation going on. But what's important is people need to be together. We need to bring people together.
Yeah, I agree. You know, and like, knowing what I know now, like, if someone were to, so I had Gord Gardner on a while ago. He at the time, was he the president of CAPSA or the executive director of CAPSA?
I don't know his
I learned a
title,
lot from that man.
Yeah. Oh, that
great conversations with him.
I've heard him speak at a few conferences.
He's wonderful.
Yeah. And he always has the best shoes.
He always has the best shoes. And the story behind why he has the best shoes is amazing, you know, because people come to him, sometimes they're down on their luck, they're looking at the floor, right? And when they look at the floor and he walks up and he's got these wildly colorful and amazing shoes, you know, like, it just like adds a little color to their day. And I'm sure I'm butchering the ideology behind it, but that was the idea that he put forward when he told us about his shoes. But yeah, like, when if someone, sorry, let me back up here, I'm stuttering around. After the show, I posted something up and I said, oh, this Gord's an addict in recovery. And right away he messaged me, like, you can't call me that, you know? And I was a little put off at that at first, because I didn't know then what I know now, even after the conversation I had with Gord. And I didn't know how to handle that. So I stopped. I didn't do anything until I had an opportunity to learn more. And now that I'm where I'm at, you know, when I see someone identifying me as an addict in recovery, like, I'm not like angry about it, but I'm like, I'm not sure that that's really who I am anymore, you know? So and that's another reason why it's important to, in my opinion, it's important to be a little bit open to having conversations that include this language, because like, people evolve. You know, people come into a conversation saying I'm an addict, and then they start engaging this conversation, not unlike what we're doing now. And that gives them an opportunity to think and consider.
And we want to give people opportunities to evolve.
Yeah.
So
That's what
That
harm
means
reduction
meeting
is.
people what they're at. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in your conversation with Gord, did that shift how you think about and perceive and use language
Oh,
in
it
your,
definitely did.
yeah?
Yeah, it definitely did. You
Hmm.
know, and it was something that always stood out to me in that conversation is he was talking about accessing services and how there is a stigma in accessing services, being able to accessing services. You come in off the street or wherever you are that you found your challenges,
Hmm.
look in a certain kind of way,
Hmm.
and healthcare providers are more likely to treat you differently,
Hmm.
you know. And he was saying like when I found my bottom, because I mean he was in addiction for a long time, you know. I think he spent 30 years. I think he even said it himself, swinging off the end of a crack pipe,
Mm.
you know. And he said when I reached out for help, what worked for me was when I walked through the doors, the doctor saw me and he said, "Congratulations for making it this far. Most people don't walk through those doors. Most people don't make that. Congratulations on making the phone call. That's amazing."
Hmm.
You know, because the stigma attached to addiction and to toxic substance use keeps people away from accessing
Hmm.
services.
And stigma exists in services and in hospitals and in healthcare and in these places, and that actually serves to, yeah, be harmful. Like if there are people who like use drugs and who have gone to an emergency department or who
Mm-hmm.
like seek help
Mm-hmm.
for something and go to a healthcare provider, and because of the stigma that they receive and they face,
They don't go
they
back.
leave and they will never go back. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's the long-term harms from that
Mm-hmm.
are greater than that, like you're disconnecting somebody potentially from that system
Mm-hmm.
permanently,
Mm-hmm.
and you know things could get worse,
Yeah.
and like that's
And then, you know, we all make our own decisions, but I would suspect that it would be challenging for someone to come to a realization what harms they may have brought in the past by displaying stigmatic behavior like that to
mm-hmm,
someone who was trying to access
mm-hmm,
services, only to find out that they passed or something
mm-hmm,
really bad happened to them as a result of them not being able to access those services. So I think it's Prairie Harm actually that's like they have educations that like Kayla
mm-hmm.
DeMong, she
Yeah.
like works with professionals. You know, and in fact, I did an episode with her a while ago, and I named it and I used the word addict in that. It was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm,
So how to not be an asshole to addicts was
mm-hmm,
how I titled it,
mm-hmm,
and like I'm gonna leave that like that because
mm-hmm,
that's like a point in time. You
mm-hmm,
know, that language what I deemed appropriate at that time.
mm-hmm.
So, um,
And I do like I think that's another important consideration, is that how we speak about things reflects like how we have learned to think about things, like how our brains understand and process things. So thinking about language, especially for service providers or people who are working in this field, it part of it is like a piece of self-reflection, like thinking
mhm,
about why you use the words that you use, the power that those words hold,
mhm,
and being intentional about yourself making that shift. So there is an internal self-reflection piece.
mhm,
And so when you were saying, that folks might, in realizing that maybe they've been using stigmatizing language and have maybe hindered access to healthcare or services, that it could be like a tough pill for some folks to swallow, to realize that maybe they have been
mhm.
implicit in some like unforeseen or broader harms that they're unaware of. Like I think that self-reflection piece is really important for people
Absolutely,
who
it
are
is.
outside of,
Yeah.
living in this world. We do have a lot of harmful language. We live in a world that isn't necessarily kind to people all the
Mhm,
time. And so I think opportunities for folks to think about how they speak and how they think about things is more needed than ever, because we have more division,
mhm,
social division than ever. And I think that, in that setting, talking about language is important because it does kind of open up a bigger self-reflection piece, or it
mhm.
can if folks are open to hearing it. And
So
that's, I guess, another piece.
yeah, yeah, that is another piece, and
Mhm.
that's why I make efforts to make our content as professional as possible, right? Like
Mhm.
if the content, if the conversation or the title doesn't bring them in necessarily, maybe they'll stumble upon it and stop for five
Mhm.
seconds and say, "Wow, that's shiny,"
Mhm.
and hear a couple
Mhm.
things.
And I appreciate your
Yeah.
wanting to make it professional. I wanted to wear, my nipple tassels here today, but I was like, no, no, this is professional.
Yeah, that's a whole nother
Yeah,
show.
yeah, that's no, that's the other streaming show I do.
Yeah,
Right,
only
right.
dance.
Yeah.
So why do you care? Like, why do you care about all this? Like, now from what I know of you, and correct me if I'm wrong, you haven't really had a lot of challenges with substance use yourself personally.
Hmm. Oh, that's a big question.
Mm,
So in my okay, where do I start with this one? So yeah, I have had alcoholism in my family on both sides, my
mm,
mom and dad's side. So I've seen oh, Heather's here. Sorry. So I've seen, like, I kind of grew up with it in a little way. I won't go into all the details of it, but I'd say why I really care is truly partly because I grew up small town Saskatchewan.
mhm,
I'm a queer male. Grew up in a small town. Didn't really fit in the world that I grew up
hmm.
in, and so
Shocking.
yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
So I learned quite early on about, feeling different and feeling isolated and excluded. And so I've carried my own kind of personal challenges just growing up with that and dealing with kind of that throughout my life. Um, and yeah, then I got some education through
Like, did you see how people who use drugs were being treated? Like, what was
oh,
your social determinant into
mhm.
getting into this?
So actually what's really interesting when I kind of like peel this back is that my first probably real exposure was through, like, so I had it in my family, but it wasn't really visible that much, and
Mhm.
it wasn't a huge, it was there, but I
Wouldn't
was,
consider it problematic at
yes,
the time.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but where I would say I probably got more familiarity, like my dad owns his own concrete pouring business, so he does a lot of like manual labor construction
Mm.
and hires a lot of crew workers
Oftentimes,
oftentimes. And so, like, here's
struggle with
another thing that
substances.
shocks people. Like,
Yeah.
my first job was actually in the concrete patch.
Oh
So,
my.
you're right. Like, things people don't
I
know.
know about
And
concrete.
yeah. And like, I'm not gonna like,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be dishonest about it. I,
Hmm.
I wasn't like, it wasn't a career. I was just a teenager or a kid, like popping in with my dad every now and again.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, like his crew, lots of working men who would, work during the week, party during the weekends. And even to this day, like my dad still will have like crew members who have experiences with substance use and
Hmm.
things like that. And so in some ways I find it very interesting that that's where it started, because now a lot of my work and my research is kind of related to employment and
Hmm.
the role that employment plays and how it connects to substance use. And when I kind of like break it down, it was like, oh, that was like, it was kind of hearing about it and seeing it in that context where
Hmm.
and this is like, that was so long ago, so this is no shade to like my dad or anyone around
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
but like
We knew what
there
we
was
knew.
some language
Yeah.
and like, like there were good workers and
Yeah.
things like that, but there was definitely a presence of it
Yeah.
there. And
Yeah.
so it's
So
been interesting to peel it back and
why don't we
realize,
take this opportunity?
yeah.
If you want to hear more about James' work, he was on the show like 2 years ago, and we talked all about, drugs at work and social
Mhm.
determinants of substance use. So if you scroll way back on the YouTube, on the Hard Knocks Talks to Facebook, sorry, not Facebook. Don't go to Facebook. Not to watch our long form stuff. No, 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 no. Go to YouTube to check out our long form stuff. It's a good conversation. It was like very early on, so like
Mhm.
the video quality and stuff is like, I'm just gonna set my ego aside for now and focus on the good
We're
conversation we
meeting you
had.
where you're at.
Yeah, yeah. Meet me where I'm at on
Yeah,
this one,
yeah,
would you?
yeah.
Or where I was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, Barb's chiming in here saying tassels can be professional. Part of me wants to see what that would look like. I want to see what that would look like. I mean, in what environment would that be considered professional? I don't know, Barb. I don't
Like,
know.
hey, like there are environments where that probably would be considered
Yeah.
professional. What
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
what is professionalism
Mm-hmm.
anyway? And what type of work is work and what work isn't work? What do
Yeah.
we consider professional
Holy
work?
fuck, calm down.
Yeah, like, you want to go into some gray areas? Here we go. Yeah.
So tell us more about what you do. I mean, you've done a lot of work into researching social determinants, and now I've known you since before you were a doctor, a PhD, and I remember like being able to. I can't wait till I can call him Dr. Dixon. And in fact, I was we had Dylan in what the heck's Dylan's last name? Merrick. Dylan Merrick.
Okay.
He knows you. I don't know if you know him. He works for Bobby Henry.
Okay.
And
The name sounds familiar.
yeah, we were
Yes.
talking about how like Dr. Dixon, and I've said this to you before, it kind of sounds like a cool supervillain name.
Dr. Dixon.
Yeah, Dr. Dixon.
I'll take that. One
Yeah.
thing I've observed just in like watching superhero movies is
Mhm.
that the villain is usually like a researcher who's like gone rogue and defies an ethics board. So I'm like, I'm actually just like a
I'm
degree or
already
two.
there.
Yeah, like I'm like I could be that person.
You're one failed radioactive experiment away.
Exactly, literally just one situation away from being that evil villain. And
Yeah.
I'm like, why do I see myself in this
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
villain role more
Get the
than the hero
steampunk
role?
goggles. Yeah. So what other determinants are you seeing? You know what? No, we're gonna axe that for now. Tell us about what you're doing now and how it relates to what we're talking about today.
Oh, so I feel like I do 1,000 things, but I kind of have two main gigs. One is research at the university, where I'm kind of leading some mental health and substance use focus on impacts of the pandemic in Saskatchewan in those areas, but also
Like
housing
in substance
and food.
use?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we did a survey last year, and we're actually working on a paper to publish some linkages of alcohol consumption and mental health here directly out of Saskatchewan from that survey. We did ask other questions in the survey about substance use, but a telephone survey asking about how people use drugs, not necessarily.
Yeah,
And it
people.
was
I
like
don't think people are
random.
gonna like
Yeah,
open up too much to that,
exactly.
especially if they're actively using. They're like, "What are you, a cop?"
And like just the way that the survey, like because it's through phone panels and like it's not necessarily super available or accessible to folks who might not have technology or whatnot. So there's limitations in, just survey data collection generally, but we did get some good stuff about alcohol consumption in there. So that's coming out and I'm looking forward to sharing that. But yeah, we also did a bunch of qualitative work. So interviews with a bunch of service providers all across Saskatchewan who are working in this field and related
What is
fields.
qualitative?
Qualitative is it's words. So where
words again. Here we go.
words.
Back to the beginning.
So yeah, kind of there's like qualitative and quantitative research. Quantitative is like the statistics, the numbers, the spreadsheets and the formulas and calculations. Qualitative is the words. It's speaking, it's reading, it's document analysis and interviews, focus groups, things like that. So connected with service providers, not specifically in harm reduction or substance use, some were, but all of the focus areas all over the province, and just the impacts of the pandemic in these 4 focus areas. And I think it's pretty well known that substance use, mental health, food, housing all got worse over the pandemic. Those issues existed before. The pandemic made it worse, and now that we're in a post-pandemic world,
the post people caring about the pandemic world.
And like that's the challenge we find, is that nobody wants to talk about the pandemic anymore. We're trying to research it because it's so important, but people are traumatized, rightfully so.
Absolutely.
It was a terrible time.
It really was. Like that was when the pandemic first hit. Holy cow. Like that put me into a dark spot. I'm happy to still be here, and still I avoided the substances and all the things. But yeah, like I remember looking back, or I remember in that time thinking, like, how could anyone possibly get sober right now? Like, how could anyone do it?
And what we're now, like what folks are saying is that now that the pandemic is over, things are worse now than they were when the pandemic was.
How do you mean?
Like the fallout of the pandemic, the trauma that folks are having, like the mental health impacts are long lasting. And pretty much everyone who I talked to described that like mental health is worse than it was before, just from the isolation, the disconnection, the fear and the uncertainty, grief and loss. There was so much pain, whether it was directly due to COVID or, the overdose crisis, which is happening simultaneous to the COVID pandemic and is still happening, but didn't get as much news or attention because
that's weird.
So
everything shut down. Like the news stations, like didn't care about anything else. Like it was all about, like, they were just pounding that fear into us for like a solid 2 years.
What was wild, and one of the things that two of the big things I took away was the power of human connection. The pandemic essentially, like through the guidelines, like we had to isolate and we had to be disconnected for our own public health and safety. And that power, the loss of that connection, not just for folks accessing services and communities, but just for everyone, like that was a significant trauma for people, and we're still seeing that. And what I have a better understanding of now is like the impacts of a global trauma such as the pandemic. Like I can fully understand why how this event in the last 2 years is the effects of that we're going to be seeing for years,
Mm-hmm.
for like people's lifetimes. Like there was not a single person who
Mm-hmm.
wasn't affected by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
How they were affected varies kind of depending on their social and economic positions. So
Mm-hmm.
like children, for example,
Yeah.
who didn't go to school or maybe had to stay away from other kids and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
like socialization and developmental challenges people are describing,
Mm-hmm.
the mental health impacts,
You know
like
what was
more coping, more stress.
interesting to me was how the liquor stores got deemed an essential service. Isn't that
That
interesting?
is interesting.
You know, and if we're talking about regulated supply, I don't like using the term safe supply. I don't like it. It doesn't feel right to me.
Barb and I just had this conversation
Oh,
yesterday. Yeah.
and what was the outcomes of that
The
conversation?
outcome is what you said first, a regulated supply.
Yeah.
So
The, I think it's very important that we maintain a perception of harm,
hmm
whether it's regulated or otherwise. Yeah, and I almost feel like I'm flogging a dead horse when I say this, but when we look at the harms brought from alcohol, I don't believe that that's the benchmark that we should trying to be set in our society. So yeah, I want to talk about language, safe supply, and then there's some people that go as far as say safer supply. Okay, well, okay, yeah. But still, you know, a regulated supply, because like I would love for my my children to be afraid of fentanyl. Like I kind of I want them to be like cautionary about it, you know.
Which
So
speaks to the importance of education again.
yeah,
And yeah, I think kind of at the start of our conversation, we were talking about how we've been kind of talking about this incorrectly or like saying the wrong things for so long. And like part of that is in our education system. And part that's also just kind of reflective of how we've been, you know, the criminalization of drugs and people who use drugs, which has been going on for over 100 years in this country. Like a lot of how we deal with substance use and people, and I say we, like the system, how we respond and deal with this is out of that like criminalized, under a foundation of criminalization.
fear-based.
And so, yeah. And so things like education, you know, drugs are in schools, whether people want to admit it or not. Drugs are in schools. Kids party. Not all kids are going to party, but of course there's access.
I sure did.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Same. Like you have access. It's unrealistic to think that it's not there.
I only tried substances because I had access to them, and that is a very interesting talking point right there. You know, we don't want. It's challenging for me to understand. Do I believe a regulated supply should be made available? Yes. Yes, I believe that. But if I look at my history through my lens, and I only ever used substances that were made available to me. So how do we offer that in a regulated supply, and use language around that regulated supply as to not reduce the perception of harm, and to not make it so available that someone who otherwise wouldn't try it can now go and try it?
And that's a huge question. And I think that's what a lot of folks, like I know folks at Simon Fraser University, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, that's what they're called. Like I know that they have been doing work on like what does like safe supply, what does a regulated supply look like? And it's, you know, it's hard to talk about it on its own, because it does, like on its own, it has its own value. But of course we can't talk about it without talking about an education piece to exactly the end you described. If these drugs are going to be accessible and available, people need to be aware and educated about them, and including the harms of them and the risks that they're taking when they use them. But also it's just completely further complicated by, you know, there are so many different models of how regulated supply can look at. We already have some models of regulated supply through prescription drugs that doctors, like if you have a prescription drug for like an antidepressant or a painkiller, you're already on a regulated supply of drugs. And so a medical model through like prescriptions and through health service providers, that is one way that some regulated supply could happen.
And I think
not the only way.
No, and I think if we And I think that it's important that we take baby steps, because we're honestly, like, we're up against a wall. The people on the other side of that wall, they don't have perhaps the same level of knowing, and we talk about, one of my slogans, lived experience is an education second to none. If they don't have that lived experience, how do we educate them in a way that goes deeper than words? How can we educate someone on a feeling? On a feeling of desperation, on a feeling of hopelessness. How do we provide that for them in language?
Oh, in language.
Yeah. How do you go deeper than language with language?
But like you bring up, it's an incredible point, because I think, I feel like I just lost my train of thought. But the uphill battle. Insane. It's an uphill battle. If there's anything that I've also learned from working in this field for over 10 years, it's that it's a constant uphill battle, and that, things like, conversations about language, while I see they're important, when I see a rabbit hole of language conversation that isn't necessarily, where you're just seeing like ideologies and values coming out, you're like, I don't know if this is a productive conversation anymore. It's hard to justify sometimes, in my experience, like putting time into some things like that, because it's such an uphill battle, and
that
the
are
fight
strictly like
is
opinion
so
oriented
slow,
or driven.
That like there's like the fight is ongoing, and it's constant, and it is slow. And part of the consequence of that is that we are in the worst drug crisis that we've ever been in, and people are dying every single day because it's such an uphill battle, and it's so slow. And so I try to be very conscious of how I exert my energy and where I exert my energy to things that, I do think language matters, but am I going to fall down a rabbit hole on like a Facebook thread about language? No, like I think there's...
Well, not about language. Tassels, maybe.
Tassels, already doing it. Like, what you don't see underneath the screen is that my tassels thread is really blowing up right now.
Really blowing up.
But it is, like, it's tough. It's an uphill battle, and sometimes you kind of got to pick your battles, I would say.
And like, I even, with the way that the government is not, Barb's blowing up the chat here. Let's look at Barb here for a minute. She's like, you guys, I'm saying lots of things. What's Barb? Barb says, prisons are the most controlled environment in the world, and we can't keep drugs out. I don't want to live in a prison, so regulated supply will reduce harms while keeping society open. Barb, I can't argue with that, but like, I've had conversations with many advocates, and they're all, safe supply, and I'm like, okay, what does that look like? Like, if you want the government to say yes to something, you have to, okay, well, this is what it could look like.
And that's where it gets complicated.
There is a part of me that does not blame the government for being apprehensive. And I can't even try to lie about that. Like, there's this is very complicated. And either, no matter what decision is made, harms will still come to some people.
And well, like, alcohol is a regulated supply, and it is the substance that we have the most harms due to. So
and the government sees that. Surely in some back room somewhere, they're like, well, do we want this again?
But we also saw when alcohol, like in the prohibition era of alcohol, that when alcohol was banned, people still drank, and what they drank was worse, and it actually caused more harm. So
we're there again.
So it's like, you can regulate. I feel like regulation is, you can't eliminate the harms, and that's kind of the
it's not harm. It's not harm elimination. It's harm reduction.
Exactly. Like, we can't get rid of drugs, so let's like do it in the safest way possible. And regulation lends itself to safer ways of like distributing and using drugs.
Better paths to
wellness.
Really
does, but it really does depend on like the type of drug and things like that. Like
with
should we be getting grape flavored fentanyl in a convenience store?
No, I don't think we should.
No,
I don't think that's a good idea.
And like, that's also like, there's so many steps that would need to happen before. Like, I think when people hear safe supply of drugs, they think that, like, so I can just
enablement.
I can just go in and buy whatever drug I want, whenever and however I want. I don't think that's how it's gonna go. Like, yes, there's commercial retail substance use or substances that are available, like cannabis stores, liquor stores, and even we're seeing more like psychedelics and things like that. Maybe those aren't
I had a
super
good
regulated or
I
legal,
I
but
had a good
like,
conversation this morning with a sacred journey facilitator,
mm,
psilocybin sacred journey facilitator.
mm.
Yeah.
And like I work with a couple researchers or a researcher who's also here in Saskatchewan and who's done a lot of her initial work on the mental health hospital, which used to be down in Weyburn, where they
Hmm.
did like acid and
Acid and everybody
LSD.
went all crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, so she's done a lot of work like documenting that.
That was
And
in the 50s, man.
right,
So long ago.
so long ago, but like they had some like promising findings, which we already knew that psychedelics can actually be helpful for mental health and dealing with trauma or addictions and things like that. And part of what I love about the psychedelics conversation is that it really does, like, I feel when she and I get together, we both talk about drugs and substances so differently.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is because we come in from very different angles. And I think like the psychedelics piece opens up another side of this conversation that I don't hear very often in like the
Hmm.
harm reduction world. And yeah, she and I are talking about maybe like writing a paper about like psychedelics and harm reduction or something together.
Oh,
Because I
well,
think,
keep me updated on
oh,
that.
like I'm very excited about it
Yeah.
because I do think it opens up the conversation. And part of what I love about this field of work is that drugs really does challenge the way, things that we take for granted about how we think about things, and it
Hmm.
makes you think differently. Drugs are psychoactive substances. They change your brain.
They do.
Researching it can also change your brain. Like it changes
Hmm.
how you think about it, and it kind of forces you to take that step back and move closer into that gray area and out of those like dualities of black and white ways of thinking and doing things
Hmm.
about, assumptions or expectations about what drugs use should or shouldn't look like, or what people who use drugs should or shouldn't do.
Hmm.
Um, it I
Should and
find the
shouldn't
field
is
is
just
so powerful. Like it
should and shouldn't.
changes, it can change how
Oh,
people think.
it gives
And
me
that's why,
anxiety when
yeah.
people say you should do this and you shouldn't do
Oh,
this,
yes.
But I think at some level there should be like basic.
It gives anxiety, but we should do it.
Yeah, but but we should consider it. Yeah. So on the topic of regulated supply, with all of the research that you've done, all the people and conversations, you've had conversations with so many people. I always like to ask this. What's the first thing? What is the first thing that you would implement? If the government said, yes, let's explore this, what would be the very first thing that you would say, okay, here's a good place to dip your toes?
Federally, provincially, municipally, what?
Let's go provincially. For the province of Saskatchewan.
For the province of Saskatchewan, first thing. Oh. Well, like I feel like there's a like pie in the sky, what I think would be great, which would
But
be
that's
like,
the end result.
yeah.
So very first thing.
First thing I would say, I would love to see them fund the safe consumption site. I think that's an immediate thing that could happen right away.
Not even that much money, really. Like if we're looking at the big picture.
Literally, Saskatchewan is the only province in Canada where safe consumption sites are not funded by the province. Federal government has, put in the policies or whatever in place that safe consumption sites are provincial jurisdiction. And so every other site that we have in this country gets funded by their provincial governments. We are the only place where that doesn't happen. And so I would say that's an immediate thing that they could do, that like just that difference there alone, that we are refusing to fund the service that is being funded everywhere else. Like that's a quick and easy step we could take.
Barb is screaming, data! I don't know why Barb isn't here right now, actually. She might as well be.
She might as well be.
She's saying more things than we are.
Data is also, and I have a lot of conversations about data. And people want data a lot. There's a lot of interest from, from some of our institutions like university, health authority, police, city, governments for more data. Another thing about Canada is that we don't really have a great substance use database. We don't. The government, feds have implemented some stuff, more monitoring than because of the overdose crisis than before. So we do have some tracking mechanisms, but we are, of like the G7 countries, I think we're like one of the only ones, if not the only one, that doesn't have a better type of mechanism of national data collection, tracking, and monitoring. And so I know there's conversations about that are happening in this city, in this province, in this country. I'm quite passionate about that because as a researcher, I know that evidence and data is a really good tool that you can use to help make change.
Like,
not the only tool. I'm not
but
going
bring it to the
privilege
public,
Yeah.
though, as
That's
well,
it.
because I mean, we've been bringing data to the government for a long time.
Well, that's
they
it,
have the
exactly.
data. They have it. You know, well,
They have some
they
that they're
okay.
not publicly sharing.
Yeah.
But
You know,
but yeah, like that's the other point is like data is not going to solve the problem. If we listened to research and evidence, I think we probably could solve a lot of our global issues that we're having. But it's, that stuff stays in the research environments,
shelves.
institutions on the shelves,
Yeah.
and they don't translate out publicly. I think that is a flaw and a fault of universities and of academia in generally.
And that's what we're doing here today.
Exactly.
That's the opposite of what we're doing here today.
Yeah, like I refuse to like work in a space that doesn't have real life or like applied like outcomes. I refuse to do research for the sake of doing research. And so that's what a lot of research does. And so where we fail is in like making the data more
mobilizing it in
a
a way that's accessible.
And
because I mean, like most people aren't going to go find academic journals and like and
it's incredibly inaccessible.
And it goes back to language right there. The best information that's available is not accessible because they're using language that perhaps the layman can't understand.
Definitely. That's another beef that I have with my profession is like, I can barely read some of these books that people are writing. Like,
this makes me want to use more drugs.
This, like, good points, valuable. Like, I love knowledge. There's so much out there, but it stalls. It doesn't make its way out further. And that's, going back to education and things like that. Like, I think we need to do better about disseminating real and honest data and information about the reality of the world we live in. Right now, a lot of the ways that we teach and we educate are kind of specific to like the economy and like not necessarily reflective of like the new kind of social and economic order of the world that we live in, where things like language, gender, and social determinants of health are so important and they matter. We see that they matter in health, and that different groups have worse off health outcomes because of different social determinants, whether it's their employment or lack of employment, low income, gender, culture, housing. Like these things absolutely matter, but for some reason talking about them is very political, and it starts to become a conversation of like the liberal elite or whatever, and it's like, no, there's actually evidence and data. This stuff matters, and just because we haven't been talking about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that we now know better, so let's teach and do better.
Well, I think we've mobilized some knowledge today.
I hope so.
I think we did all right.
Lot.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. I think we'll cap it there. But hang on a sec, I got a cough. Leave us with something. Leave us with something valuable. Is there anything that you'd like to cap it off with?
I think just I do think there's so much incredible stuff coming out of this field, the field of substance use. I think the power of this world to change people's minds and how they think about things, I think it's there. And that's part of what I really love about the work that we do, is that it really does force people to look at things differently. And we need to look at things differently because the world is tough. So I want to celebrate that, but also to recognize that it's been on the backs of and the deaths of like thousands and thousands of people, and so much pain, suffering, and trauma. And, we cannot forget that this is a real crisis that we're living in right now in real time. And truly, the longer we take in this uphill battle, people are literally dying with every, political conversation and ideological conversation and everything that slows it down. Like the price we pay is human life. And if people have questions or comments for you, is there a place that they can find you? Yes. An email. That's such a boring researcher thing to say. My email, I would love to talk to anybody. I love talking about this
What's
stuff.
the email address?
james.dixon@usask.ca.
Okay, we'll make sure we put that in the show notes too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, James, thanks so much for joining us today. Great conversation.
Mhm.
Thanks for sharing your expertise with us, and we'll let you go. If you're watching on Facebook right now, jump over to YouTube. We're going to stop streaming to Facebook, so hopefully we'll see you over there in the future. And that's it for now. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you Sunday night. Take care.